The lone figure of Vaughn Hayes appeared against the setting sun, his silhouette etched against the crimson horizon like a solitary monument to freedom. The dust from the trail clung to his weathered denim and leather as he guided his chestnut mare toward Riverside, Wyoming Territory. The year was 1875, and like most springs, Vaughn had no intention of staying in one place longer than it took to resupply. Maybe enjoy a proper bath and a whiskey before the open trail called to him again. "Come on, Penny," he murmured to his horse, patting her neck as they approached the cluster of buildings that made up the modest but growing settlement. "Just a few days of rest for you, a job or two for me, and we'll be back where we belong." Riverside nestled along the banks of the North Platte River, a burgeoning town that had sprung up to serve ranchers, travelers, and those seeking new beginnings in the West. It wasn't Vaughn's first visit, but it had been nearly 2 years since he'd last passed through. The town had grown, sprouting new buildings where empty lots had once stood. The soft glow of lantern lights spilled from windows as dusk settled over the valley. Vaughn guided Penny toward the livery stable, the familiar sense of hay, horses, and leather greeting him as he approached. "Well, I'll be," a gravelly voice called out as Vaughn dismounted, "if it ain't the wind himself blown back into town." Vaughn turned to see Josiah Miller, the aging stable master, emerging from the shadows, a pitchfork in his gnarled hands. "Evening, Josiah," Vaughn tipped his hat. "Still keeping this place standing, I see. Takes more than time to knock this old-timer down," Josiah replied with a toothy grin. "Need a place for your girl?" Vaughn nodded, already reaching for Penny's saddlebags. "Treat her well. She's carried me through 3 territories without complaint." "Always do," Josiah said, taking Penny's reins. Planning on staying a while, Vaughn shook his head, slinging his saddlebags over his shoulder. "Just passing through, few days at most." The older man chuckled. "You always say that." "One day, Hayes, something's gonna anchor that restless soul of yours." "Not likely," Vaughn replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Know if the boarding house has any vacancies." "Mrs. Parker's place," Josiah considered. "Should do." "Lost a few guests to the new hotel they built last year, fancier place down by the Mercantile." Vaughn fished a coin from his pocket. "I prefer simple, and Mrs. Parker's cooking." "Smart man," Josiah said, pocketing the coin. "She still makes that apple pie that'll make a grown man weep." After ensuring Penny was settled, Vaughn made his way down the main street. Riverside had indeed grown. A proper bank now stood where once there'd only been a money lender's office, and the general store had expanded. The saloon, however, looked exactly as he remembered it. The temptation of a whiskey tugged at him, but Vaughn opted for finding lodging first. The weight of 3 days' hard riding settled in his bones as he approached the 2-story clapboard building with Parker's boarding house painted in neat letters above the door. The front parlor was warm and smelled of beeswax and cinnamon. A plump woman with silver-streaked hair looked up from her knitting, her face lighting with recognition. "Vaughn Hayes, as I live and breathe," Martha Parker exclaimed, setting aside her work. "It's been an age since you darkened my door." "Evening, Mrs. Parker." Vaughn removed his hat. "Hoping you might have a room to spare for a few nights." Martha stood, smoothing her apron. "For you, always. The back room upstairs is free, quietest one in the house." "Much obliged," Vaughn said, fishing for his wallet. Martha waved him off. "Pay me tomorrow after you've had a proper rest. You look dead on your feet, young man. Have you eaten?" "Not since noon." "There's stew keeping warm on the stove. Go wash up and I'll fix you a bowl." 20 minutes later, Vaughn sat at the kitchen table, a bowl of rich venison stew and fresh bread before him. He'd scrubbed the worst of the trail dust from his hands and face, though a proper bath would have to wait until morning. "So what brings you back to Riverside?" Martha asked, settling across from him. "Last I heard, you were riding with a cattle outfit up Montana way." "Just passing through," Vaughn replied between mouthfuls. "Thinking of heading to Colorado, heard there's work with the ranches around Denver." Martha studied him. "Always moving." "When are you going to plant roots somewhere, Vaughn Hayes?" He offered a tight smile. "Not in my nature, madam. Every man needs a home eventually. Got all I need right here." He patted the saddlebags at his feet. "Freedom to go where the wind takes me." Martha sighed. "Well, your room's waiting when you're ready." Clean sheets and a soft pillow. Sometimes that's all a body needs to reconsider what matters. Vaughn doubted that, but he kept the thought to himself. After finishing his meal and thanking Martha, he climbed the familiar stairs to the second floor. The back room was indeed quiet, overlooking the garden rather than the street. A simple brass bed, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small writing desk, and a rocking chair by the window made up the furnishings. It was more than enough for a man who often slept under the stars. He set his saddlebags on the floor and his rifle against the wall before sitting on the bed to pull off his boots. The mattress was soft, almost too soft, after weeks of sleeping on the ground. Vaughn stood to remove his gun belt, hanging it on the bedpost where it would be within easy reach. It was only then, as he turned back the bedspread, that he noticed a quilt that hadn't been there when he'd first entered the room. It lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed, its colorful pattern catching his eye in the lamplight. Vaughn frowned, certain the quilt hadn't been there minutes before. He approached it cautiously, as if it might somehow spring to life. The patchwork was intricate blues, reds, and golds arranged in a pattern of stars and wheels that seemed to tell a story all its own. His fingers traced the careful stitching, the fabric worn soft with age and use, yet still vibrant. "Mrs. Parker," he called, stepping back into the hallway. "Did you leave something in my room?" No answer came. The boarding house had fallen quiet, the other guests likely already retired for the evening. Vaughn returned to examine the quilt more closely. It wasn't like the plain blankets Martha usually provided. This was a family piece, the kind passed down through generations. The craftsmanship spoke of countless hours of patient work, each stitch placed with purpose and care. Something about it unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in the way a familiar face in a crowd of strangers might give one pause. He lifted the quilt, feeling its surprising weight, and a faint scent of lavender and something else, perhaps sage, drifted up from the fabric. After a moment's hesitation, Vaughn refolded the quilt and set it on the rocking chair. He'd ask Martha about it in the morning. For now, the siren call of sleep was too powerful to resist. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the curtains and the distant sounds of Riverside coming to life. Vaughn woke with the sun, as he always did, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath him. His eyes immediately sought the rocking chair. The quilt was gone. He sat up, scanning the room. Nothing else appeared disturbed. His gun belt still hung from the bedpost. His saddlebags remained untouched on the floor. But the quilt had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Vaughn dressed quickly, buckling his gun belt around his waist before heading downstairs. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drew him to the kitchen, where Martha was bustling about, preparing breakfast for her boarders. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," he greeted her, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Did you come into my room last night?" Martha paused, spatula in hand. "After you went up. No, why would I? Someone left a quilt on my bed. Patterned thing, stars and wheels. Thought maybe you'd put it there." Martha's brow furrowed. "I don't recall any such quilt among my linens, and I certainly wouldn't enter a guest's room without knocking." She hesitated. "Was something taken?" "No, madam, just the opposite. The quilt appeared, then disappeared." "How curious," Martha said, returning to her cooking. "Perhaps you dreamed it. You were exhausted last night." Vaughn knew he hadn't imagined it, but he let the matter drop. Perhaps. After breakfast, Vaughn headed into town. He needed supplies and figured he might as well check if there was any short-term work to be had before moving on. The sheriff's office seemed as good a place to start as any. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn was a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper mustache who'd held his position in Riverside for nearly a decade. He looked up from his desk as Vaughn entered. "Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod. "Thought I saw your tracks coming into town yesterday. Staying out of trouble." "Always do, Sheriff," Vaughn replied. "Just passing through, looking for honest work if there's any to be had." Blackburn leaned back in his chair. "As it happens, Ben Murray over at the Mercantile is expecting a large shipment tomorrow. Could use a strong back for unloading and organizing. And I heard the Maxwell Ranch lost a hand last week, broke his leg when his horse stepped in a gopher hole." "Appreciate the leads," Vaughn said. "Anything else I should know about town since I was last here?" We got a doctor now, proper one from back east. Young woman, if you can believe it. Miss Ruby Hartwell. Set up practice last winter. Folks were skeptical at first, but she proved herself when scarlet fever came through. The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Saved a lot of lives, including my youngest. Vaughn raised an eyebrow. A female doctor, out here. Times are changing, Hayes, Blackburn replied. She's as good as any male sawbones I've seen, better than most. Got a gentle touch, but doesn't flinch when things get bloody. Interesting, Vaughn said, though he had no particular need for a doctor's services. Think I'll see about that work at the Mercantile. As he turned to leave, the sheriff called after him. Oh, and Hayes. The Willow Creek gang's been spotted in these parts. Keep your eyes open. They've hit 2 stage coaches in the last month. Vaughn nodded his understanding. Outlaws were a fact of life in the territories, and he'd had his share of run-ins over the years. The Mercantile proved fruitful. Ben Murray was indeed grateful for the offer of help, and agreed to pay Vaughn for 2 days' work unloading supplies and reorganizing his storeroom. The pay wasn't much, but it would cover his board and leave a little extra for the trail ahead. As Vaughn exited the store, his attention was drawn to a modest building across the street. A freshly painted sign hung above the door, Dr. R. Hartwell, physician. Through the window, he glimpsed movement, a woman in a practical dark blue dress, her auburn hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Something about her posture, straight-backed yet graceful, as she moved about the room, held his gaze longer than he intended. When she turned toward the window, Vaughn quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the thought of being caught staring. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Vaughn helped Murray inventory new stock, then took the time to replace some worn items from his own kit, a new bandana, sturdy matches, coffee, and hardtack for the trail. By evening, he found himself at the Lucky Strike Saloon, nursing a whiskey and observing the other patrons. The saloon had added a piano since his last visit, currently being played with more enthusiasm than skill by a young man in a striped vest. Mind if I join you? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Vaughn looked up to see a man about his age, well-dressed in a manner that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Free country, Vaughn replied with a nod to the empty chair. Daniel White, the man introduced himself, extending his hand. Own the lumber mill north of town. Vaughn Hayes, he replied, shaking the offered hand. Just passing through. White signaled the barkeep for a drink. I know who you are. You helped my cousin's outfit drive cattle to Cheyenne 3 summers back. Said you were the best horseman he'd ever seen. Vaughn's memory clicked into place. Robert White, tall fellow, talks with a bit of a stutter when he gets excited. That's him, Daniel confirmed with a laugh. He's doing well, started his own spread down near Laramie. Their conversation drifted through various topics: cattle prices, the railroad's expansion, local gossip. White was good company, neither prying too deeply nor talking only about himself as many successful men tended to do. You know, White said as the evening wore on, I could use a man like you at the mill, foreman position. Pays good, works steady. Vaughn shook his head. Appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking to settle. So Robert said. White nodded. Said you were born with itchy feet. Still, offers open if you ever change your mind. By the time Vaughn returned to the boarding house, the hour was late. Mrs. Parker had left a lamp burning low in the parlor, but the house was quiet, its occupants asleep. He made his way upstairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step he remembered from previous stays. His room was just as he'd left it that morning, or so it seemed at first glance. Then his eye caught on the foot of the bed, and his hand instinctively moved to his revolver. The quilt had returned. This time, it was spread across the foot of his bed rather than folded. In the lamplight, the pattern seemed even more intricate than he remembered, not just stars and wheels, but what appeared to be a map of sorts, with rivers and mountains suggested in the careful arrangement of fabrics. Vaughn approached it cautiously. The quilt had to belong to someone, and someone was clearly entering his room when he was absent. The thought did not sit well with him. He inspected the window, locked from the inside, undisturbed. The door had shown no signs of being forced. Either someone had a key or... This is foolishness, he muttered to himself. Quilts didn't appear and disappear of their own accord. There had to be a logical explanation. Too tired to puzzle it out further, Vaughn prepared for bed. He considered moving the quilt, as he had the night before, but finally decided to leave it where it lay. Perhaps he could catch the mysterious visitor if they came to retrieve it again. His sleep was deeper that night, filled with vivid dreams of places he'd never seen: a valley with a distinctive formation of 3 peaks, a river bending around a stand of cottonwoods, a cabin nestled against a hillside. Throughout it all, there was a sense of something or someone waiting. Vaughn woke before dawn, the quilt now drawn up around his shoulders, though he had no memory of pulling it over himself in the night. The scent of lavender and sage seemed stronger, mingled now with a hint of pine. He sat up, fully alert despite the early hour. The dream images remained unusually clear in his mind, especially the 3 peaks. Something about them tugged at his memory, as if he should recognize the landmarks. Slipping from bed, Vaughn struck a match and lit the lamp. The quilt pooled around his waist, its colors muted in the soft light. On impulse, he examined it more closely, tracing the stitched patterns with his fingertips. There, in the corner, nearly hidden within the design of a flower, were initials. R.H. R.H., the same initials as the doctor, Ruby Hartwell. Vaughn frowned. Why would the town doctor be sneaking into his room to leave her quilt? It made no sense. They hadn't even met. When full daylight arrived, Vaughn was already dressed and downstairs, helping himself to coffee from the pot Martha had left warming on the stove. His plan for the day was clear: finish the work he'd promised Murray, then seek out Dr. Hartwell and get to the bottom of the mysterious quilt. Martha appeared from the pantry, surprised to find him up so early. "You're an early bird today, Mr. Hayes." "Always did prefer morning hours," he replied, though in truth he'd risen earlier than usual. "Mrs. Parker, what can you tell me about Dr. Hartwell?" Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ruby, she's a fine physician. Came from Philadelphia with impressive credentials, though some folks still can't accept a woman doctor." She studied him curiously. "Are you feeling unwell?" "No, madam, just curious. Heard about her from the sheriff." Martha nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "She's a private person, keeps to herself when not tending patients, lives above her practice, unmarried though not for lack of suitors." She paused, then added, "She has a special way with quilts, you know, makes them for special patients sometimes, says there's healing in the stitches." This caught Vaughn's attention. "Quilts, beautiful work. Learned from her grandmother, I believe. Each one tells a story, she says." Vaughn considered this new information as he sipped his coffee. "Did she bring many with her from back east?" "Just the one she keeps on her own bed, far as I know. Makes new ones here." Martha gave him a curious look. "Why the interest in Ruby's quilting, of all things?" Vaughn shrugged. "Just making conversation." After breakfast, he headed to the mercantile where Murray's shipment had arrived early. The work was straightforward: unloading crates from wagons, unpacking goods, arranging merchandise. Physical labor had always provided Vaughn a certain peace, allowing his mind to work through problems while his body stayed busy. By midday, they'd made good progress, and Murray insisted Vaughn take a break. "Go get some lunch, son. We'll finish up this afternoon." The suggestion suited Vaughn fine. It gave him an opportunity to visit Dr. Hartwell's practice under the guise of a casual introduction, rather than barging in with accusations about mysteriously appearing quilts. The doctor's office was quiet when he entered, a small bell above the door announcing his arrival. The waiting area was neat and surprisingly homey, with comfortable chairs and recent newspapers laid out on a table. "Be right with you," called a feminine voice from the back room. Moments later, a woman appeared, the same auburn-haired figure he'd glimpsed through the window the day before. Up close, Dr. Ruby Hartwell was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with intelligent green eyes and a dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her practical dress was covered by a white apron, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Dr. Hartwell." "Vaughn Hayes, madam," he replied, suddenly aware of the dust on his clothes from the morning's work. "I'm not here for medical reasons, just wanted to introduce myself, being new in town." Something flickered in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Well, Mr. Hayes, welcome to Riverside," she said. "Though I understand from Sheriff Blackburn that you've passed through before. Word travels fast in small towns." "It does indeed," she agreed with a small smile. "What brings you back to our little corner of Wyoming?" "Just following the trail," Vaughn replied. "I rarely stay anywhere long." Dr. Hartwell nodded. "A true wanderer, then. I've met a few in my time." She gestured to the chairs. "Would you care to sit? I have no patients scheduled for another hour." Vaughn hesitated, then accepted. Up close, he noted the faint shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting recent nights with little sleep. Despite this, there was a vibrancy about her, an energy that seemed at odds with her composed exterior. "The sheriff speaks highly of you," he said. "Says you saved his boy during the fever outbreak." "I was fortunate to have the right training and medicines," she replied modestly. "Many people contributed to fighting that epidemic. Still, it's not common to find a female doctor out here." "No, it isn't," she agreed, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Though I assure you my gender has no bearing on my abilities." "Never suggested it did," Vaughn replied mildly. "Just making an observation." An awkward silence fell between them. Vaughn found himself studying her hands, capable hands with slender fingers, a small scar across the left knuckles. Not the soft, pampered hands of an Eastern lady, but those of a woman who worked hard. "Mrs. Parker mentioned you're a quilter," he said finally, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, it's a hobby of mine. Helps clear my mind after difficult cases." "I'd imagine you need that in your profession." "Everyone needs something, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Some find it in a bottle, others in a book. I find mine in fabric and thread." She tilted her head, studying him. "And what about you? What clears your mind on the trail itself?" he answered honestly. "New horizons, freedom." "Freedom from what, I wonder?" The question seemed to slip out unbidden, and she immediately shook her head. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." Before Vaughn could respond, the bell above the door jingled and a woman entered, supporting a young boy with a tear-stained face clutching his wrist. "Dr. Hartwell," the woman began anxiously. "Tommy fell from the hayloft. I think his arm might be broken." The doctor was on her feet immediately, all business. "Bring him this way, Mrs. Collins." She turned to Vaughn with an apologetic smile. "Duty calls, Mr. Hayes." "It was a pleasure meeting you." "Likewise," Vaughn replied, standing. "Perhaps we'll speak again before I leave town." "Perhaps," she echoed, her attention already shifting to her patient. "Tommy, let's have a look at that arm, shall we?" Vaughn left the doctor's office with more questions than answers. Ruby Hartwell had reacted to his mention of quilting, but not in a way that suggested she'd been sneaking into his room at night. Either she was an excellent actress, or there was more to the mystery than he'd first thought. He returned to the mercantile to complete his work, the encounter with the doctor replaying in his mind throughout the afternoon. By evening, the job was finished, and Murray paid him as promised, with a bonus for the careful organization of his storeroom. "You ever want steady work, Hayes? I could use a man like you," Murray offered. "Appreciate that," Vaughn replied, pocketing the money, "but I'm moving on soon." "So you always say," Murray chuckled. "One day something's gonna change your mind." Vaughn shook his head. "Not likely." That night, after a simple supper at the boarding house, Vaughn returned to his room with a certain apprehension. Would the quilt appear again? And if so, how could he determine who was placing it there? His question was answered as soon as he opened the door. The quilt lay across his bed, arranged differently than before. Now it was spread fully, its pattern displayed in its entirety. In the lamplight, Vaughn could see that what he'd taken for a decorative border was actually a series of small scenes: a cabin, mountains, horses, a river. But what truly caught his eye was an object placed in the center of the quilt, a small leather-bound book. He approached cautiously, listening for any sound that might betray another's presence in the room. Hearing nothing, he picked up the book. It was a journal, the leather worn smooth with handling. When he opened it, a pressed wildflower fell out, a small purple blossom he recognized as prairie smoke. The journal's pages were filled with neat, feminine handwriting. The first entry was dated 5 years earlier. April 12, 1870. At last, I have found the valley of my dreams. 3 peaks to the north, just as grandmother described in her stories. The cabin needs work, but the location is perfect hidden, yet with access to water and good hunting grounds. I know coming west alone was considered madness, but I feel more at peace here than I ever did in Philadelphia. The medical school rejection was a blessing in disguise, forcing me to forge my own path. Vaughn frowned. The entry confused him. The doctor had obviously completed medical school if she was practicing now. And the description of the valley with 3 peaks, it matched his dream exactly. He flipped through more pages, scanning entries. June 8, 1870, treated my first patient today. A trapper with a badly infected wound. He was skeptical of a lady doctor, but had little choice. When the fever broke, his gratitude was payment enough. Word will spread. This is how I'll build my practice. September 30, 1870, the quilt is coming along well. Grandmother always said a healing quilt must tell a story, and this one tells mine. Each piece holds memories, hopes, places I've seen or wish to see. The stitching is a form of prayer. She taught me each one a wish for healing. December 25, 1870, Christmas alone is strange but not unpleasant. The cabin is snug against the snow. 3 patients came this week despite the weather. Progress. Vaughn continued reading, increasingly puzzled. The journal chronicled the life of a young female doctor in a remote cabin, not in Riverside. Yet it was clearly Ruby Hartwell's journal. She mentioned her medical training, and the initials RH appeared at the bottom of several entries. The entries continued through 1871 and 1872, describing a growing practice, the changing seasons, occasional visitors. The writer seemed content in her isolation, though sometimes wistful for companionship. Then the tone changed. March 15, 1873, riders came today. 3 men, rough types. I treated one for a bullet wound, no questions asked. They paid well, but their presence unsettled me. The leader watched me in a way that made my skin crawl. I barred the door after they left. March 20, 1873, they returned, said they needed a place to lie low. I refused them entry. The leader, Garrett is his name, grew angry, said they'd be back, that remote cabins need protection. I fear I've made a dangerous enemy. The next entry was scrawled hastily, the handwriting no longer neat. April 3, 1873, they burned it. Everything. The cabin, my supplies, my books. I escaped with only what I could carry, my medical bag, this journal, grandmother's quilt. I'm hiding in the hills now. Garrett's men are hunting me. I don't know why they've targeted me so viciously. Perhaps merely because I refused them, and men like that can't abide a woman with a mind of her own. The entries grew sporadic after that, describing a desperate flight through the wilderness, hiding from pursuers, surviving on foraged food and the occasional kindness of strangers. The writer was making her way east, hoping to reach more populated areas where she might find safety. The final entry was dated nearly a year ago. May 17, 1874, I dreamed of him again. The man who will help me. I've never seen his face clearly, but I know he's a wanderer, someone who values freedom above all else. Grandmother always said our dreams can reach across time, that her quilt would find him when the moment was right. I must believe this. I must hold on to hope that justice will come, that what was taken can be restored. Until then, I will build a new life here in Riverside, where no one knows my past. Where I can be simply Dr. Ruby Hartwell, respectable physician, not the woman who lost everything to thieves and murderers. Vaughn closed the journal, his mind racing. None of this made sense. Ruby Hartwell was here in Riverside practicing medicine. She'd come from Philadelphia, according to Martha Parker. Yet this journal told a completely different story of a cabin in a remote valley, of violence and flight, of dreams of a stranger who would help her. And the quilt that kept appearing in his room was supposedly imbued with some power to find this helper from her dreams. It was nonsense. Mystical nonsense that had no place in Vaughn's practical worldview, and yet, the dream he'd had of the 3 peaks and the valley. The exact valley described in the journal. How could he have dreamed of a place he'd never seen unless? Ridiculous, he muttered aloud, returning the journal to its place on the quilt. He needed to speak with Ruby Hartwell directly. Tomorrow he would confront her with the journal and the quilt, demand an explanation for how they kept appearing in his room. But for now, exhaustion pulled at him. Vaughn removed his boots and gun belt, too tired to bother with the rest of his clothes. He stretched out on the bed beside the quilt, intending only to rest his eyes for a moment before moving the mysterious items. Sleep claimed him instantly, and with it came dreams more vivid than any he'd experienced before. He saw Ruby Hartwell in a simple cabin, treating patients, tending a garden, working by lamplight on the very quilt that now lay beside him. He saw 3 men arrive, the confrontation, the fire that consumed everything. He felt her terror as she fled into the night, the quilt and journal her only possessions. Then the dream shifted, and he saw the leader of the men garrote a tall figure with cold eyes and a knife-edge scar running from temple to jaw. He saw the man counting gold coins, laughing with his companions in a saloon Vaughn recognized with a shock as the lucky strike here in Riverside. Vaughn woke with a gasp, dawn light filtering through the curtains. The quilt was wrapped around him like an embrace, and the journal lay open on his chest. For several minutes, he lay still, sorting through the implications of the dream. If what he'd seen was true, then the men who had destroyed Ruby Hartwell's home were here in Riverside. Perhaps they'd followed her. Perhaps it was coincidence. Either way, she was in danger, and for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Vaughn felt responsible for her safety. He dressed quickly, tucking the journal inside his vest. After a moment's consideration, he carefully folded the quilt and placed it in his saddlebags. If the items truly belonged to Ruby Hartwell, he would return them to her. But first, he needed answers. The boarding house was quiet as he descended the stairs, the hour still early enough that other guests remained abed. In the kitchen, he found Martha already at work, kneading dough for the day's bread. "You're up with the chickens again," she observed. "Heading out already?" "Not yet," Vaughn replied. "Need to settle some business first. Mrs. Parker, how long has Dr. Hartwell been in Riverside exactly?" Martha thought for a moment, dusting flour from her hands. "Let's see, she arrived last November just before the first snow, set up practice immediately." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Vaughn said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Has she spoken much about her past?" "Not particularly. Said she trained in Philadelphia, came west for the opportunity." Martha eyed him shrewdly. "You've taken quite an interest in our doctor, Mr. Hayes." "Any particular reason?" Vaughn evaded the question. "One more thing, have any strangers come to town recently? A man with a scar on his face, perhaps?" Martha's expression grew serious. "As a matter of fact, yes. 3 men rode in 2 days ago, staying at the hotel rather than here. One does have a nasty scar." She lowered her voice. "Sheriff's keeping an eye on them. They don't look like honest business types." Vaughn's stomach tightened. The dream had been accurate about that, at least. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I should go, without breakfast. I'll get something later." The morning air was crisp as Vaughn made his way toward the doctor's office. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their establishments, the blacksmith's forge already glowing. He moved with purpose, his hand occasionally brushing the revolver at his hip. The doctor's office was dark, the closed sign still hanging in the window. Of course it was barely past dawn. She likely lived upstairs, as many business owners did. Vaughn hesitated, then moved to the side of the building where a narrow staircase led to a second-floor entrance. He climbed quietly, conscious of the early hour, and knocked softly on the door. No response came. He knocked again, louder. "Dr. Hartwell," he called. "Ruby Hartwell," still nothing. Unease prickled along his spine. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, unusual for a woman living alone. Drawing his revolver, Vaughn eased the door open. "Dr. Hartwell, it's Vaughn Hayes. Forgive the intrusion, but I need to speak with you." The apartment was neat and simply furnished a small sitting room leading to what appeared to be a bedroom. A half-eaten meal sat on a small table, a book open beside the plate as if the reader had been interrupted. "Ruby." Vaughn moved cautiously through the space, checking each room. The apartment was empty but showed no signs of struggle or violence. Whatever had called the doctor away, she had gone willingly, or had appeared to. Vaughn holstered his weapon and quickly searched for clues to where she might have gone. A leather medical bag was missing from its hook by the door. On a small desk, he found papers, patient records, correspondence, and at the bottom of the stack, a wanted poster. The poster showed 3 men, crude sketches but recognizable. The leader was identified as James Garrett, wanted for murder, robbery, and arson in Colorado Territory. The text mentioned the burning of a remote homestead and the presumed death of its occupant, one Dr. Rose Hamilton. RH, the same initials as Ruby Hartwell. The pieces clicked into place. Ruby Hartwell was Rose Hamilton, the woman from the cabin. She'd changed her name, created a new identity after escaping Garrett and his men. And now they had found her. Vaughn's jaw tightened. He needed to find her, and quickly. He hurried downstairs and across to the sheriff's office, relieved to find Blackburn already at his desk. "Sheriff," Vaughn began without preamble, "those 3 men who rode in, where are they now?" Blackburn looked up, surprised by the urgency in Vaughn's voice. "Checked out of the hotel at first light. Why? Did they say where they were headed?" "Mentioned something about visiting an old friend," Blackburn replied, his eyes narrowing. "Hayes, what's this about? Dr. Hartwell is in danger," Vaughn said bluntly, dropping the wanted poster on the desk. "These men attacked her before, burned her home. She changed her name, came here to start over." The sheriff scanned the poster, his expression darkening. "Damn, I knew they were trouble but didn't make the connection." He stood, reaching for his gun belt. "How do you know all this?" Vaughn hesitated. The truth about the quilt, the journal, the dreams would sound like lunacy. "She confided in me," he said finally. "I think they've taken her back to where it all began, a valley with 3 peaks to the north. 3 Sisters Valley," Blackburn nodded, "about 2 days' ride northwest of here. Remote area, good hunting, few settlers." He checked his revolver. "I'll gather some men, follow as soon as we can." "No time," Vaughn said. "I'm leaving now, they have too much of a head start already. Hayes, don't be a fool, those men are killers. Wait for backup." But Vaughn was already moving toward the door. "Send your men when they're ready. I'm not waiting." Within 15 minutes, he had collected Penny from the livery, ignoring Josiah's curious questions about his sudden departure. His saddlebags were packed, the mysterious quilt among his possessions, the journal secure in his vest pocket. He'd left money with Martha Parker to cover his board, along with a brief note explaining his sudden departure. As he rode out of Riverside, Vaughn tried to make sense of his own actions. Why was he risking his life for a woman he barely knew? He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, responsibilities, anything that might tether him to one place or person. Yet here he was, chasing armed men to rescue Ruby Hartwell or Rose Hamilton, driven by dreams and a quilt that appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Perhaps he was losing his mind. Or perhaps, for the first time in years, he was finding something worth fighting for. The trail northwest from Riverside was clear enough at first, following established routes used by hunters and trappers. Vaughn pushed Penny hard, knowing he needed to close the gap between himself and Garrett's party. If they had forced Ruby to guide them to her former home, perhaps believing she had valuables hidden there, they would be traveling slower. 4 people on 3 horses. By midday, he reached a fork where the main trail continued north toward the Montana border, while a less traveled path branched northwest toward the mountains. Vaughn dismounted, scanning the ground for signs of recent passage. Their hoofprints from multiple horses, one set deeper than the others, suggesting a mount carrying 2 riders. They had taken the northwest fork, confirming his suspicions. Vaughn allowed Penny a brief rest, watering her from his canteen and offering a handful of oats from his supplies. As the horse ate, he studied the quilt, now spread across his saddle. In daylight, its pattern was even more revealing, the 3 peaks clearly visible in the design, as well as a river's winding path and what appeared to be landmarks along the way. "A map," he murmured, tracing the stitched path with his finger. She made a map in the quilt. With renewed determination, Vaughn remounted and continued northwest, using both the trail signs and the quilt's pattern to guide his way. By nightfall, he had covered impressive ground, but was still at least a day behind Garrett's party. He made a cold camp that night, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. As he lay beneath the stars, the quilt providing unexpected warmth against the spring chill. Vaughn found himself thinking of Ruby, of her courage in building a life alone in the wilderness, of her resilience in starting over after losing everything. Sleep brought more dreams, clearer now, more detailed. He saw Ruby as a child, learning quilting from an elderly woman who must have been her grandmother. He saw her struggling through medical studies, facing rejection and ridicule from male colleagues. He saw her decision to head west, to practice medicine her own way, answering to no one. And he saw her watching him from the shadows of the boarding house, placing the quilt on his bed, hope and fear mingling in her green eyes. Vaughn woke before dawn, more certain than ever that he was on the right path. The quilt had chosen him, somehow, to be Ruby's protector. The how and why of it mattered less than the fact that a woman's life hung in the balance. The second day of travel brought him into increasingly rugged country. The trail narrowed, winding through pine forests and across rocky streams. Signs of Garrett's passing remained: clear broken branches, disturbed stones, occasional remnants of brief rests. By late afternoon, Vaughn caught his first glimpse of the three peaks rising against the horizon exactly as they had appeared in his dreams and in the quilt's design. They formed a distinctive pattern, the middle peak slightly taller than its siblings, all three topped with a dusting of snow despite the spring season. The valley would lie just beyond if the quilt's map was accurate. Vaughn slowed his pace, now moving with greater caution. If he rode directly into their camp, he would be outnumbered and outgunned. Surprise and strategy would be his only advantages. As dusk approached, he left Penny secured in a sheltered glade with access to water and grass. From here, he would proceed on foot, using the gathering darkness as cover. The valley revealed itself gradually as he crested a pine-covered ridge. Below, a natural meadow stretched alongside a meandering creek, bordered by stands of aspen and cottonwood. Near the far edge of the meadow, barely visible in the fading light, stood the blackened remains of a cabin, little more than a chimney and portions of stone foundations surviving the fire that had consumed it. And there, beside the ruins, gleamed the small light of a campfire. Vaughn dropped to his belly, crawling forward until he could make out figures moving around the fire. 3 men and a woman, the latter with her hands apparently bound before her. Ruby. Vaughn studied the situation carefully. The men had made camp directly beside the ruined cabin, using one partially standing wall for shelter. Their horses were picketed near the creek. Ruby sat apart from the men, her posture straight despite her bonds, her face occasionally illuminated by the flickering flames. Garrett was unmistakable, tall and lean, the scar on his face visible even at this distance. He paced around the fire, gesturing occasionally toward the cabin ruins, his voice carrying faintly on the evening breeze, though the words were indistinct. Vaughn needed to get closer to hear what was being said. Moving with the stealth developed through years of hunting and tracking, he worked his way down the ridge and across the meadow's edge, using the lengthening shadows for cover. "Wasting our time," one of the men was saying as Vaughn came within earshot. "There's nothing here but ashes." "She's hiding something," Garrett insisted. "Doc, like her, living alone out here, had to have something valuable, gold maybe, or something else worth selling." "I had nothing of value beyond my medical supplies." Ruby's voice was clear and steady, showing no fear despite her situation. "I've told you that repeatedly." Garrett crouched before her, his face inches from hers. "And I don't believe you. Women don't come west alone, set up in the middle of nowhere without a reason. You were hiding from something or someone." "I was hiding from no one until you and your men destroyed my home," Ruby replied coldly. "I came west because I wanted to practice medicine without interference from men who think they know better than I do." Garrett laughed. "Feisty little thing, aren't you? Well, we've got all night to search these ruins, and if we don't find anything..." He drew a knife, using the tip to lift a strand of her hair. "Maybe I'll take something else of value." Ruby's expression remained defiant, but Vaughn could see her hands trembling slightly in her lap. He had heard enough. The men were focused on Ruby and their conversation, their guard down. It was now or never. Vaughn checked his revolver, then moved silently around the perimeter of the camp, positioning himself behind the broken wall of the cabin. From here, he had a clear shot at all three men with Ruby safely out of his line of fire. Taking a deep breath, he called out, "Garrett, step away from the lady." The reaction was immediate. All three men spun toward his voice, hands moving to their weapons, but Vaughn had the advantage of position and surprise. He fired twice in rapid succession, his first bullet striking Garrett's right shoulder, causing him to drop his drawn revolver. The second shot hit one of the other men in the leg, sending him sprawling with a howl of pain. The third man managed to get off a shot that splintered wood inches from Vaughn's head before Vaughn's return fire caught him in the chest. He collapsed without a sound. Garrett, despite his wounded shoulder, lunged toward Ruby with his knife raised. "You brought him here," he snarled. "You'll die for that." Vaughn vaulted over the broken wall but knew he wouldn't reach them in time. Ruby, however, was not helpless. As Garrett reached her, she rolled to the side, bringing her bound hands up to deflect the knife. The blade cut through her bonds instead of her flesh, and in the same motion, she drove her newly freed elbow into Garrett's wounded shoulder. The outlaw howled in pain, dropping the knife. Ruby scrambled away as Vaughn closed the distance, his revolver trained on Garrett's head. "Don't move," Vaughn ordered. Garrett froze, his face contorted with pain and rage. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing ladies threatened," Vaughn replied evenly. "Ruby, are you hurt?" She shook her head, rising to her feet with dignity despite the ordeal. "No." "Thank you for coming." The wounded man on the ground groaned, trying to stem the bleeding from his leg. Ruby hesitated, then moved toward him, the doctor in her overcoming any fear. "I need my bag," she said. "It's with their supplies." Vaughn kept his gun on Garrett as Ruby retrieved her medical bag and began tending to the wounded outlaw. Even the man who had threatened her life minutes before received her professional attention once she had stabilized his companion. "The bullet went through clean," she told Garrett as she bandaged his shoulder. "You'll live, though you'll likely hang once the sheriff arrives." "Why are you helping me?" Garrett asked through gritted teeth. "Because I took an oath," Ruby replied simply, "and because I am not like you." With both surviving outlaws securely bound and their wounds treated, Ruby finally allowed herself a moment of reaction. She sank onto a fallen log near the fire, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Vaughn retrieved a blanket from the outlaw's supplies, draping it gently around her shoulders before sitting beside her. "Sheriff Blackburn and his men should be a day behind us," he said. "We'll need to wait here for them." Ruby nodded, staring into the flames. "How did you find me?" "How did you know?" Vaughn hesitated, then reached into his saddlebags and withdrew the quilt and journal. "These led me to you." Her eyes widened as she took the items, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns of the quilt. "You had these? How?" "They appeared in my room at the boarding house," Vaughn explained. "I thought at first someone was entering when I was gone. Then I read the journal, had dreams of this place, of what happened to you." "My grandmother's quilt," Ruby whispered. "She always said it had power, that it could find help when needed, guide the right person to wherever I might be." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I thought it was just stories, the kind grandmothers tell children, but after the fire, after I escaped, I kept dreaming of a man who would help me, a wanderer. I never saw his face clearly, but you knew me when I walked into your office," Vaughn finished for her. She nodded. "I thought I was losing my mind. I never consciously put the quilt in your room. I kept it hidden in my apartment. Yet each morning it would be gone, only to return by evening. And the journal, I wrote in it each night. It was therapy, I suppose, a way to process what had happened, to hold on to hope." She touched the leather cover gently. "I never imagined anyone would read it." They sat in silence for a time, the implications of what had occurred settling between them. Eventually, Ruby spoke again, her voice soft. "Why did you come after me, Mr. Hayes? You could have simply left town, continued on your way. No one would have blamed you." Vaughn considered the question. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Something about that quilt," he said finally. "Something about your story. It called to me, I suppose. A man who never settles down, answering a call to help a woman who had to start over," Ruby mused. "Perhaps my grandmother knew what she was doing after all." The night deepened around them. Garrett and his wounded companion eventually fell into uneasy sleep, their soft groans occasionally breaking the silence. Ruby and Vaughn took turns keeping watch, sharing the blanket as the mountain air grew chill. During her watch, Ruby rebuilt the cabin in quiet words, describing to Vaughn how it had looked, what she had planned for it. "It was to be my life's work," she said. "A place where anyone could come for healing, regardless of their circumstances." "It could be again," Vaughn suggested. "The foundation remains. Timber is plentiful. With help, a new cabin could rise here." Ruby smiled sadly. "Perhaps, but I've made a life in Riverside now. I have patients who depend on me." "Riverside isn't far," Vaughn found himself saying. "A person could have both a practice in town, a place to retreat when the work becomes too much." She studied him curiously. "Are you suggesting I rebuild, Mr. Hayes?" "I'm suggesting possibilities," he replied, surprising himself with the direction of his thoughts. "And please call me Vaughn." Morning brought the distant sound of approaching riders, Sheriff Blackburn and 3 deputies, arriving a day earlier than expected due to hard riding. The sheriff took in the situation with a professional eye, nodding approval at Vaughn's handling of the outlaws. "You did good work here, Hayes," he said as his men secured the prisoners and the deceased outlaw for transport. "Couldn't have done better myself." It was Dr. Hartwell who truly saved the day, Vaughn replied, watching as Ruby explained her dual identity to the sheriff. Blackburn listened to her story without interruption, then simply nodded. "Your secret's safe with me, Doc. Far as I'm concerned, you're Ruby Hartwell, and that's all Riverside needs to know." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ruby said with genuine gratitude. The journey back to Riverside was slow due to the wounded prisoners. Ruby rode double with Vaughn, her arms wrapped around his waist, the quilt and journal secure in his saddlebags. They spoke little during the ride, each lost in their own thoughts, yet there was a comfort in their shared silence. 2 days later, they arrived in Riverside to a hero's welcome. Word of the outlaws' capture had preceded them, though the details of Ruby's past remained known only to Vaughn and the sheriff. Martha Parker fussed over both of them, insisting they needed proper meals and rest after their ordeal. That evening, after the excitement had died down and the town had returned to its normal rhythms, Vaughn found himself on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset. His original plan had been to leave Riverside the following morning, to continue his journey to wherever the trail might lead. Yet something held him back, something more than the mysterious quilt that now lay folded at the foot of his bed. Footsteps on the porch boards announced Ruby's arrival. She had changed from her traveling clothes into a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders rather than in its usual practical knot. "May I join you?" she asked. Vaughn nodded, moving over on the bench to make room for her. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the western horizon in shades of gold and crimson. "I came to thank you properly," Ruby said finally, "for believing in the impossible. For coming after me when no one else would have understood why." "No thanks necessary," Vaughn replied, "though I'm still not entirely sure I understand myself." Ruby smiled. "My grandmother would say that some things aren't meant to be understood, only accepted." She hesitated, then added, "She would also say that when a wandering soul finds something worth stopping for, they should pay attention." Vaughn turned to study her face in the fading light. "Are you suggesting I'm meant to stop wandering, Dr. Hartwell?" "I'm suggesting possibilities," she echoed his words from the valley. "And please call me Ruby." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Vaughn found himself thinking not of the open trail ahead, but of the valley with 3 peaks of a cabin rebuilt, of a life that combined freedom and purpose. "I've been thinking about that valley," he said slowly. "About what you said regarding your plans for it. Have you?" Her voice was carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed hope. "It's good land. Remote, but not too far from town. A man with carpentry skills could rebuild that cabin before winter, make it better than before." "And do you know such a man?" Ruby asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I might," Vaughn replied, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "If he had a good reason to stay." Ruby's hand found his on the bench between them, her fingers intertwining with his. "I believe he might find several reasons if he looked carefully enough." The next morning, Vaughn did not leave Riverside as planned. Instead, he sought out Daniel White at the lumber mill, discussing the materials needed for a cabin in Three Sisters Valley. By afternoon, he had secured a job helping White with a large lumber order work that would keep him in Riverside for at least a month while plans for the cabin took shape. That evening, as he returned to his room at the boarding house, Vaughn found the quilt once again spread across his bed. This time, however, there was no mystery to its appearance. Ruby had placed it there herself, along with a note inviting him to dinner at her apartment the following evening. As he ran his fingers over the intricate stitching, Vaughn reflected on the strange path that had led him here. All his life, he had prided himself on answering to no one, belonging nowhere. Freedom had been his only constant companion. Yet now, as he traced the pattern of three peaks and a river valley stitched in blue and gold, Vaughn Hayes discovered a surprising truth. Sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from avoiding connections, but from choosing the right ones. The quilt had found him, as Ruby's grandmother had promised it would. And in finding Ruby, Vaughn had perhaps found himself as well. Over the weeks that followed, Vaughn divided his time between work at the lumber mill, preparations for the cabin rebuilding, and increasingly frequent evenings with Ruby. They shared stories of their pasts, discovered common interests, and gradually mapped the contours of a possible shared future. By midsummer, the foundation for the new cabin was laid in Three Sisters Valley. Vaughn and Ruby traveled there on weekends, camping beside the emerging structure. What had begun as Vaughn simply helping to rebuild her lost home had evolved into planning a place for both of them, a retreat where Ruby could continue her healing work away from town, and where Vaughn could satisfy his need for open spaces without leaving behind the woman who had captured his heart. The quilt traveled with them on these journeys, spreading its colorful pattern across their bedroll beneath the stars. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, Ruby would trace its design, telling Vaughn stories of her grandmother's belief in its magic. She said a true healing quilt holds pieces of the past, present, and future, Ruby explained one evening as they sat beside their campfire. That's why she taught me to include places I hadn't yet seen, people I hadn't yet met. Like me? Vaughn asked, his arm around her shoulders. Ruby nodded. There's a figure here, see? She pointed to a small shape within the quilt's border, a rider on horseback, face turned toward the horizon. I stitched it without knowing why. Now I understand. By autumn, the cabin was enclosed, its sturdy logs and stone chimney promising warmth for the coming winter. Vaughn had taken permanent employment with White's lumber mill, discovering he had a talent for the work and an unexpected satisfaction in being part of a community. Ruby continued her practice in town, but spoke increasingly of dividing her time between Riverside and the valley once the cabin was fully habitable. Together, they gathered furnishings, some purchased, others handcrafted by Vaughn in the evenings. On the first snowfall of the season, Vaughn took Ruby to the valley to see the completed fireplace. As flames leapt behind the iron grate, casting warm light across the simple but comfortable space, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. I've never been a man of many words, he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. And I've certainly never been a man to put down roots, but it seems I was waiting for the right reason. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. Ruby Hartwell or Rose Hamilton, whichever you prefer, would you consider adding another name to your collection? Mrs. Hayes has a certain ring to it, I think. Tears sprang to Ruby's eyes as she looked from the ring to Vaughn's face. Are you certain? You said you'd never settle down. I'm not settling, he replied, taking her hand. I'm choosing. There's a difference. Their wedding took place in Riverside that Christmas, with Martha Parker insisting on hosting the reception at her boarding house. Sheriff Blackburn gave the bride away, and Daniel White stood as Vaughn's best man. The entire town turned out to celebrate the union of their respected doctor and the formerly footloose cowboy who had somehow found his place among them. The quilt, now framed and hanging on the wall of their Riverside home, served as a constant reminder of the mysterious forces that had brought them together. Sometimes, Vaughn caught Ruby studying it with a thoughtful expression, as if reading messages in its pattern that only she could see. By the following spring, the cabin in Three Sisters Valley was a regular weekend retreat for them both. Ruby established a small infirmary there, treating trappers, prospectors, and settlers from the surrounding area who might otherwise go without medical care. Vaughn built additional structures: a stable, a workshop, eventually a separate building to serve as Ruby's clinic. On a warm evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the three peaks in shades of gold, Ruby placed Vaughn's hand on her stomach with a smile. "It seems the quilt has one more surprise for us," she said softly. "There's a cradle stitched into the corner that I never fully noticed before." Vaughn's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you saying?" Ruby nodded, her eyes shining. "By winter, there will be 3 Hayes souls in Three Sisters Valley." 9 months later, their son was born in the cabin his father had built. They named him Samuel, after Ruby's grandfather who had first settled in the valley decades earlier. As the baby slept in his cradle crafted by Vaughn's own hands, Ruby added a new section to the quilt, incorporating fabric from Vaughn's old bandana and threads the color of their son's eyes. "For the next generation," she explained, "so he'll always find his way home, no matter how far he roams." Vaughn, watching his wife's skilled fingers work the needle, reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had once defined freedom as the absence of ties, the ability to leave at a moment's notice with nothing but his horse and saddlebags. Now he understood that true freedom came from choosing those ties, from building something worthwhile to return to. The open trail still called to him occasionally, and sometimes he answered riding out for a day or two to satisfy that restless part of his spirit. But he always returned, drawn back by bonds stronger than any that had ever threatened to hold him down. Years passed, and the Hayes family grew. Samuel was joined by a sister, Olivia, and later, another brother, James. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all, and the clinic became known throughout the territory for Ruby's exceptional care and Vaughn's handcrafted healing support splints, crutches, and therapeutic devices he designed based on Ruby's medical knowledge. Riverside flourished as well, growing from a small settlement into a proper town with a schoolhouse, church, and eventually a train station that connected it to the wider world. Vaughn became a respected member of the town council, his practical nature and straightforward approach to problems earning him the community's trust. On the 20th anniversary of their meeting, Vaughn surprised Ruby with a special gift: a small replica of the original cabin, carved in wood with exquisite detail, down to the quilt hanging from a tiny clothesline. "To remember where we started," he said as he presented it to her. Ruby, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, examined the carving with misty eyes. "Who would have thought that a quilt on a stranger's bed would lead to all of this?" "Not the stranger, that's certain," Vaughn replied with a smile, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I was so determined to keep moving, never looking back. And now I know that the best journeys are the ones we choose to make together." He kissed her gently. "Thank you for showing this old cowboy that putting down roots doesn't mean giving up freedom." That night, as they lay beneath the quilt that had brought them together, Ruby whispered, "Do you ever regret it? Staying in one place for so long?" Vaughn considered the question, his hand absently stroking her hair. "Not once," he replied honestly. "Every day with you has been an adventure greater than any I found on the trail." And as they drifted toward sleep, Vaughn Hayes, once the most restless soul in the Wyoming Territory, realized that the mysterious quilt had given him not just a family and a home, but the greatest gift of all: a heart finally at peace with where it belonged.